In our study of the life divine, we are at a passage of a single paragraph spanning about one page, in which Sri Aurobindo is describing the way in which nature brings out new possibilities. And this, he says, is everywhere the process of nature, and to ignore it is to miss the intention in her works and get lost in the maze of her procedures. We have read this last time. We studied it in detail in the first half of the paragraph, and the second half remained to be explored in detail. The key idea in this is that we can read the first few lines and we'll set the context again. In the very nature of things, all evolution must proceed at first by a slow unfolding. At first, later it can speed up. For each new principle that evolves its powers has to make its way out of an involution in inconscience and ignorance. It has a difficult task in pulling itself out of the involution, out of the hold of the obscurity of the original medium, against the pull and strains, the instinctive opposition and obstruction of the inconscience, and the hampering mixture and blind, obstinate retardations of the ignorance. And we dwelt last time on each of these words, taking examples of what they mean, what they represent, and the difficulty they create, and what nature has to do to come out of that difficulty. We had also drawn upon that image, very vivid, of the stone out of which the consciousness has to pull itself. And I took the image of that carving, which is there in Akshardham, of the carver emerging from the stone and cutting his own way out. Literally, the consciousness emerging out of inconscience is struggling against all this as it pulls itself out bit by bit. And all the elements, obscurity, the nature of the medium, the character of pull, the character of strain, the opposition, obstruction, hampering mixture, retardation, each of these is a different kind of difficulty that has to be overcome by the emerging consciousness. And of course, all this makes it a very difficult process and slow at first. Then, in the next 3 sentences, Sri Aurobindo describes these 3 stages in which this emergence takes place. Within each of these stages, there are, let's say, sub-stages and many facets to each of these. We had read the first one and we were to do the second and third today. But we will reread the first one without going into the kind of depth we saw last time, just to refresh ourselves. Nature affirms at first a vague urge and tendency, which is a sign of the push of the occult, subliminal, submerged reality towards the surface. So that reality which is occult, subliminal, submerged, and we saw the distinctions between these 3. As it pushes its way out, the first sign that something is coming up is a vague urge and tendency, and we saw the difference between these 2 also. There are then small, half-suppressed hints of the thing that is to be, imperfect beginnings, crude elements, rudimentary appearances, small, insignificant, hardly recognizable quanta. And of these also we saw each of these words is so precisely describing one of the aspects of this emergent process. I had taken some examples last time of how these can be. The one example which I had dwelt in some length was the tendency in humanity today to become healthy or to take charge of one's health, and how in its early forms it can be almost crude or deceptive in what it is really trying to do. But if you look more deeply, you see where it's going. In evolutionary terms, it is the attempt of the consciousness now to overcome its nature's limitations and assert a deeper or higher possibility or even a personal will over the limitation of nature. There's another such which is also seen in a very confused manner today, and you will see this as a vague urge and tendency, and it is the sense of confusion between genders, and it takes weird forms, unhealthy forms, even perverse forms. But the fact that it's come up in such a strong way everywhere, and even elements in the media have seized upon it in a perverse way perhaps, but the fact that people are still interested and curious points to something of this vague urge and tendency of nature. But you're looking through many layers at what nature really wants, and you don't see what nature wants. You see the distortions rather. And there is even an attempt to create more confusion by classifying and making further divisions. There was a recent article in the New York Times that declared by some study that 36 types of gender exist. And I had a good laugh because it's so ridiculous. You can, of course, add a 37th and 38th, and in some public program where we were, I said, I'm 39th. Each human being is unique. To try to create artificial categories, somebody else speaks of 64, they have no meaning at all. But the fact that there is this obsessive and perhaps unhealthy focus in trying to create these kinds of division points to something else. What is it that it points to? And if we look at the bigger picture of evolution, the mother describes the supramental being as being essentially sexless. That is, there are no more sexual organs because they serve no purpose. They still have a masculine or feminine expression of consciousness, which does serve a purpose, which is part of the evolutionary intention. But the form in which it is fixed in the physical world ceases to have relevance in the supramental creation. In fact, in one of the very interesting discussions Mother has about the vital world, she says that even in the vital world you will not find beings with a sexual, with a gender, and they don't have sexual organs. And very few that you find are in the lower range of the vital world, where it is as if the physical world has put out its influence into the vital. But beyond that, nothing. And this is what you will see even in the art of religions, when they describe a being of the higher world. If you see in European art, the archangels or even angelic beings, the head may have a form which represents a more masculine, feminine kind of dress appearance, but the face itself is almost genderless. And that's the reality. When you see those beings, you cannot say it is male or female. But it expresses some aspect of the divine consciousness, either the Ishvara aspect or the Ishvari aspect, and that's about it. Even in India, you will find this concept, except where in the later forms, the vocabulary of the Ishwari aspect and Ishvara aspect have been given very distinctly, she and he, but in the form in which they are represented, they seem to transcend the gender limitations. So here is a possibility which is much more true, towards which nature is working, and as she is trying to push towards that, on the surface part of humanity, there are mixed tendencies, vague urges, and half-suppressed hints, imperfect beginnings, crude elements, rudimentary appearances, etc. Now all of this, Sri Aurobindo is going to apply later to the emergence in religion, occultism, spiritual philosophy, and the direct spiritual experience, the four streams through which nature is opening us to the higher reality. But this paragraph is a general statement of the whole movement of emergence of any deeper reality through the surface forms of nature. Keep this at the back of the mind, because as we look at these, the next step, the second step, and the third step, we can also resonate with and recognize those similar trends in religions and in occultism and philosophy. So this was first phase, where you have only a vague urge and tendency and these crude appearances. Now we come to phase 2. Afterwards, there are small or large formations. I'll read the whole thing, then we'll come back to details. A more characteristic and recognizable quality begins to show itself, first partially here and there, or in a low intensity, then more vivid, more formative. Finally, there is the decisive emergence, a reversal of the consciousness, the beginning of the possibility of its radical change. Radical change is not yet, but it has come into its own. But still, much has to be done in every direction. A long and difficult growth towards perfection lies before the evolutionary endeavor. And all this is phase 2, where out of what was unrecognizable and only a vague tendency, something has come into its own and can be recognized. But the stages of recognition are what he describes, which we will look at. And then the third phase is when, because it has come into its own, it starts organizing itself, confirming, securing against relapse, and opening out its possibilities, which we will see later. So keep in mind these 3 stages. Notice the 3 stages also apply to us. In any emergence of a spiritual possibility within us, of any spiritual experience within us, when we try to make an effort to develop some even inner possibility, even if not spiritual, possibility of inner sight or inner perception or internal awareness of deeper layers of the inner mind or inner vital. Let's say you train yourself, for example, to become sensitive to thoughts in the atmosphere, or to energies in the environment, or to perceive at a distance, or hear or feel at a distance. If you begin the training, it will go through these 3 stages. And the first stage, you will have these vague urges, tendencies, signs of something pushing towards the surface, little hints, imperfect beginnings, crude elements, hardly recognizable quanta. A little bit happens, but you can't say it is that. Now, second stage, you begin to recognize, where the earlier stage, the quanta is so small, you say, is it that? Maybe it is. Maybe it's my imagination. It's vague. Now, afterwards, there are small or large formations. A formation is now a form which has acquired a fixity. Because it is fixed, you can recognize. And so, a more characteristic and recognizable quality begins to show itself. The quality is now characteristic of the movement which is emerging. The quality is now distinctly formed. You can recognize, this is what it is. And it can have small or large formations. Why does he bother to say that? Because it's either small or large, isn't it? But precisely he says it because in some people, in some situations, the formations can be very small, but still it is this thing. In rare cases, it can be a large formation, still it is this thing. And he's highlighting these because you will see both tendencies separately in the history of religions, or even in occultism, or in our own internal experiences. And now the quality begins to show itself, but first partially, here and there, or in a low intensity, then more vivid, more formative. Now this is another substage. When the first quality emerges, then it is still partial, and occasional or weak, low intensity. I will take another example of a trend of nature, which is the emergence of what earlier would have been called genius. Power of intuition to act through the mind. That's genius. When people say, oh, so and so is a genius, it's not your brain working faster. It is your mind opening to a higher poise of consciousness of intuition, which is now either reflecting or leaking out through the normal working of mind. And since the whole evolutionary push is towards the supramental, well, it has to make its first step towards the intuitive mind. And so wherever there is this push, you will find this stage. Even, I will use the phrase which Aurobindo speaks of in his last writings, what he calls the mind of light. And that is the first formation through which humanity will pass, where it can already begin to organize a divine life, but long before a full supramentalization can take place. And so, in a sense, that is our immediate, stable focus towards which we have to work. And so, the mind of light is something which nature is working towards. Vague, vague urges, tendencies, difficult to recognize earlier. But where it has come up now, we see distinctly small formations, rarely large at this point, but again it might happen suddenly. But where it appears partially, you see in the person a shift in the way they think. And either it happens that the person switches his way of thinking and then switches back and forth, or the old way of thinking suddenly begins to dull, and the person finds it difficult to think and may even wonder, am I losing my intelligence? Am I growing more stupid? But instead something higher is beginning to settle, which is more direct and which is of a more intuitive character. And often people confuse. It can happen, and it is a common experience. You have a deep spiritual experience, and in the immediate aftermath of the experience, you find you are not able to function normally. And you struggle. You struggle to get back to your old way, when in fact you should now stabilize into the new way. But one of the elements of the struggle is, I can't think the way I used to. And rather than going back, we should be attempting to go forward. But this first appearance of this tendency is quite distinctly seen off and on in a few individuals here and there. I've often tried to, where I meet people where it's quite distinctly seen, I often try to look for what is it that is common among them. Well, some of them obviously know of Sri Aurobindo, even if they have not read of the Mind of Light or have no idea of it. And I thought maybe that connection to his consciousness and the mother's consciousness would be an aid. But I found equally people who had no such connection and in whom the thing is forming. And the one thing common I have seen is a kind of a spontaneous tendency to interiorize and trust the inner, truer feel. Where there is something of that inner touch which has organized itself and the surface personality is trusting it, there you see this happening rapidly. And so the person, when he has to take a decision, pauses and tries to feel. And just that act of an inward turn prepares the way for something deeper and higher now to begin to organize. Instead of falling back into the old way of thinking, behaving, or following the normal training that we have in our school education, where you're just taught to think superficially. So the characteristic and recognizable quality is seen, and you can view the mind becoming more quiet, the turn inward to have deeper knowledge and things like that. First partially here and there, or in a low intensity. And this takes the form of genius, I said, because often such people come out with extraordinary insights, or some extraordinary creativity. It doesn't always take the form of a technical knowledge. It can be a practical knowledge. It can be things they make or the way they express themselves in speech or thought or in relationships. Something spontaneous with a feel of the intuition that is there. And it can be low intensity. But eventually, as they begin to trust it, it stabilizes, becomes more firm, and so then more vivid, more formative. And by the word formative, he means it takes on a more distinctive form. A first small or large formation, but now, having begun with a partial appearance, it becomes more formative and fixed. Finally, there is the decisive emergence, a reversal of the consciousness, the beginning of the possibility of its radical change. So again, within this are three stages. When it has now come into its own, it can say, here I have come out. Here there is a power which is active. I can rely upon it. I can rely on the intuition. I can rely on a deeper source of knowledge or discrimination. But then, a reversal of consciousness. The moment I can rely on this, where do I put more of me? On that on which I can rely. And the other, which I cannot rely upon anymore, my old way of thinking, that begins to fade. So there's a reversal. But before this can happen, when you have those experiences still somewhat vague, somewhat mixed, you can't rely on it. So you have this swinging between two worlds. You're thinking in a normal way, and of course, frustratingly, it leads you nowhere. And then you say, okay, I need to draw on something deeper. You turn within, you feel, and something comes. And it works sometimes. It works partially other times. And occasionally you find it's heavily mixed. And you can't depend on it. You can't stand up in a public space and say, I know such and such a thing is happening from my intuition. You will be ridiculed or proved wrong, perhaps. And so you are not so sure about declaring it. You have to verify. But once it has stabilized enough, you can say, oh yes. How you express it publicly is different, but you can say, yes, this is so. And I'm sure we can find the evidence if we look for it. Sri Aurobindo has written, for example, in his Foundations of Indian Culture, he writes of how certain tendencies and certain characteristics which he describes as being quite common in the past, he says they can still be found today if we look for them carefully. Now, he was in Pondicherry already more than a decade, although he had been all over India during his years of freedom struggle. Still, the kind of insight and precision with which he would describe types did not come from a limited human experience, but from the direct intuitive knowledge and identity of the experience. And so he could say very definitely, yes, this is there, this can be found. Where, of course, one has to work within certain limitations. If he was asked, perhaps he could. If he chose to, no. I give an example here of Edgar Cayce, who was one of the very reliable, they called him sleeping prophet. He would go into a state of trance and he could be asked questions about the health of people, and often this was done through letters. The person reading out a letter would say, I am now referring to such and such a person from such and such a city. Name is given, and then after a moment, Casey will say, yes, I have him before me, ask your question. And then he will give detailed medical diagnosis, describe cures, and so on. Many of those cures did not fit into conventional medicine then. Many have Ayurvedic type of forms and so on. In one particular case, he says, there is a particular standard medicine. He names the medicine and says, this will cure him. So they go looking for the medicine and they find that the medicine is no more in production. It has been ended a few years before. So they come back to Casey and ask him, a few years the medicine has been terminated, no more in production, can you please suggest some other? He says, no, the medicine is still available. You will get it from a particular, and he names a shop in a particular town. He says, you'll still find one bottle there. So in a state of trance, he has as if access to all knowledge. So these people go looking for it, they go to the shop. The shopkeeper says, oh yes, I used to have it. He looks all over, cannot find the bottle. He says, sorry, run out of stock. They come back to Edgar Casey and say, well, we didn't find it in the shop. Now this time, third time, Edgar Casey says, go to the shop, go to such and such a cupboard, on such and such a shelf, and you'll find the bottle behind other bottles. And they go there and they find it. It was the only bottle left perhaps, and it cures the person also. This kind of precise knowledge is accessible to a person in a state which, at least overtly, does not require a very high level of spirituality. Perhaps he had something, but in this life it was not seen other than a very generous, moral, ethical personality. One didn't see too much of that higher range of spiritual access. But he had the inner access, entering the inner mind, and in the inner mind opening to something of the universal consciousness and knowledge. He had access to what was needed. But this kind of precise access is available to all of us in principle. And it does not need a very spiritual development for that. But I'm giving this as an example to show how the reliability of a power can grow, and when it becomes reliable enough, or even more reliable than your existing power of knowledge, power of cognition, obviously you will shift to that. And when you shift to that, you know, even if the evidence outside you is all against it, you know what the truth is, and you can state it with firmness, and if necessary, find even the justification from its power, from that power of cognition. So we are at a level of transition in human evolution from the rational mind, the age of reason, which is pretty much ended. It's being described today as postmodernism. But the character of the postmodernism is a turn inward to subjectivity. And of course, there's the superficial, egocentric subjectivity which says whatever I feel is fine. But it leads you to nowhere, it leads perhaps even to greater confusion. But if you go deeper now and access this deeper cognition and power of knowledge, which is greater than your reason and intellect, and if that begins to now develop as it is seen in a few, as that begins to be more reliable, you will find when you have access to it at will, it is far more reliable than the best of your intellect could give you. Obviously, you switch to it and now lean more on it. And when you lose it, it's almost as if you feel yourself blinded. Where earlier I could see, and now when I fall out of that state, I have to think, I'm blinded. I cannot see anymore the way I used to. And the seeing was so much wider, freer, deeper, more reliable, more detailed, rich. So this substage is one of a reversal of the consciousness. The moment the emergence is decisive, well, it's going to lead to a reversal. And after that, third substage, beginning of the possibility of its radical change. When now you've reasonably stabilized yourself in this, the radical change is now possible. But it's the beginning of the possibility. It's not yet the full possibility. So Sri Aurobindo's wording is so precise. Why is it only a beginning of possibility? Because the full possibility requires this new consciousness to become so secure that you cannot fall out of it anymore. If on the other hand, you are in a state of consciousness, now let's say a higher faculty of intuition is more developed, you are beginning to rely on it thinking, yes, I'm there, but it's actually a little bit mixed. Very quickly you will find the mixture increasing, because in relying upon this you're also allowing the mixture of your old habit of thought to creep in, thinking that you have it. And then comes the crash, the fall, the worst mistake possible because you've discarded reason as a counter check. If you hold reason as a counter check, then you're not fully here either. So it's the beginning of a radical change, but not yet there. And what is needed for that will be what comes in the third stage. You'll see the sub-stage of third stage is securing, preventing from a fall, preventing from mixture and dilution. But we complete this, and now having come to this beginning of possibility of radical change, he warns it's not done. But still much has to be done in every direction. And he will list the various kinds of direction, because the thing which is emerging has to grow in height. Higher level of consciousness, higher level of grade of working. It has to grow in subtlety. You can have a power. Let's take the example of the intellect. Our power of intellect we consider to be reasonably well developed. We are thinking human beings after all. What we don't recognize is that in most of us, it's actually not developed to its full potential. It's developed to the level that you needed to pass an exam in school. And then you were declared Bachelor of Science or Arts or Master of Science or Arts. You have mastery, no way. But, well, that was enough to get through. But the power has to first ascend in height. And what that means is, and I'm still talking of the intellect, not the intuition. The intellect itself has still higher rarefied levels. We had this interesting conversation after the Friday class where we discussed how Mother speaks of thinking without words. And we were not taught that. And the moment you start thinking, shift your thought level to a point above words, you realize how different, how much more liberating and free your thinking power becomes. And then finer gradations within that, thinking with ideas, thinking with pure concepts, thinking with an experience, that's when your intellect is on the borderline of entering the intuitive mind. But it's still intellect. You're thinking with experience. And you have no words at all required. In fact, if you stay within that zone too long, you lose the link to words. And now you have a brilliant idea, but you struggle to find the way to articulate. So initially one has to slide between these layers to as if bridge them. But there still remains, my point was, there still remain finer gradations in height of our power of intellect to grow. Second direction of growth is subtlety. In the mind, the subtle shift of nuances and suggestions. When, as we saw in the example here, Sri Aurobindo uses this word vague urge and tendency. And there's a subtle difference in concept. But we have to pause and think. And as we begin to dwell upon these subtle differences, we become also more precise in our articulation. We become more clear in distinctions between thoughts. Take, for example, just at random, a word like joy and happiness. Ask yourself what you mean when you use the word joy and what you mean when you use the word happy. And can you feel in your thought, or at first let's say in your experience, what is the difference? And then can you articulate in your thought the difference in nuance? And then can you explain it to somebody else? And it's a subtlety, but just one example. And there are all kinds of facets even within the development of subtlety. So you have height, subtlety, and then riches is another direction to have a rich variety of experience, thoughts, ideas, etc. And often, initially, this grows by reading, but reading not a few narrow tracks, but widely, richly, and especially reading the opposite viewpoints and their justifications. You may recall Sri Aurobindo in his earlier years, after he came back from England, was reading something like a box full of books every week. So he would have these books coming in, he would receive them, and at the end of the week he would send them back. And somebody asked him, well, do you even bother to read them? And yes, he would be reading a book a day. Of course, we don't know the size of the books, but still, that's a lot of reading. What it does is exposes you to so many different mind types, ways of thinking. Elsewhere, Aurobindo speaks of how, I think the mother speaks of how, every country has a different mind type. A way of thinking is so different. And when you begin to interact, you may think that they're thinking similarly, but as you enter into their mind, you find it's something totally different. And of course, within cultures and then across individuals. This richness of types, but also of thought, opens you to a glimpse of how complex reality is and how rich it is, and your mind has to be capable of that richness. That's the third direction of growth. And fourth direction, Sri Aurobindo writes, is wideness. To be able to now encompass a range of ideas, including a range of ideas which might appear to be contradictory, but you're able to hold them from a poise in which they are no more contradictory, but aspects of a larger, more encompassing vision, perspective, or master idea, if we may use that term, of which these are specialized ideas. And to make the mind wide in this way, combined with the richness, subtlety, and height. Imagine what that would be like. Your mind turns to appreciate something, and it has all this height, subtlety, richness, wideness in which it looks at a particular issue. And if you want to know what that's like, well, read Sri Aurobindo. When he takes up any issue, you will find all these four facets. And then he also uses three more words: dominant, all-embracing, comprehensive. But we'll see all that later. So still, much has to be done in every direction of this new consciousness that has emerged. So let's say the intuitive mind is now developing. It has come into its own. You can recognize now here is an intuitive faculty. It has to grow in its utmost height, subtlety, richness, wideness in the intuition itself, and then become dominant, all-embracing, and comprehensive in the intuition. And we have not had any of that. All we have is a stable island which has emerged. A long and difficult growth towards perfection lies before the evolutionary endeavor. And remember, all this is being done by poor nature, pushing forward a new power, a new faculty, or a new capacity in a species which is otherwise utterly resistant to it and has the gravitational pull of wanting to stay what it is and not wanting to rise to something new. So now comes the third stage, where he describes the sub-stages of this, what has to be done. The thing done has not only to be confirmed, secured against relapse and the downward gravitation, against failure and extinction, but opened out into all the fields of its possibilities, its totality of entire self-achievement. Its utmost height, subtlety, riches, wideness. It has to become dominant, all-embracing, comprehensive. This is stage 3. And you can see, obviously within this are sub-stages which he has mapped out. Of this, the first sub-stage is to confirm this new possibility which has emerged. And then secure against relapse and downward gravitation, against failure and extinction. So these are finer aspects of the sub-stage. And then opened to all fields of its possibility, its totality of entire self-achievement. So let's look at each of these in sequence. First step is confirmed. And you'll find this phrase Sri Aurobindo repeats many times in his writings. Even in his writings in the Veda, you will find this word confirming. And there we get a hint of what this really means. In the Veda, Sri Aurobindo describes how certain riks invoke one of the gods, psychological powers, aspects of the divine, psychological functions or energies, whatever it represents, you invoke. The thing begins to comes perhaps, settles for a while. Is it vague? Is it stable? Is it complete? We don't yet know, but something is felt. And at that point you have the riks, the verses which confirm. And the sense of confirming is fixing. So you have let's say, a feeling, a subtle sense of an experience, a sense perhaps of a very fine, soft opening within the heart, of a turn of the heart or devotion towards the mother in a movement that is of self-giving and a joyous self-giving. You feel it, and you can say, it feels nice, and then you get on with your life. It fades out, you've lost it. But if instead you catch that which comes, not too hard, because if you seize it too hard, then you lose it. You have to rather give yourself to it, open yourself and let it grow. And by dwelling in it, you allow it to stabilize, become more complete, more firm. That's how you confirm, make firm, fix. And as it grows, you give to it the necessary value and importance. Cherish it as the most valuable thing within you. And again, that fixes it, makes it more stable, invites it to spread and stabilize. Every spiritual experience is given first as a glimpse. And if you say, yes, now I've had it, it's done, you lose it. You have to make the necessary effort of containing and allowing it to settle and grow and stabilize. In spite of our best effort, you still have to sleep at night, and you wake up the next day and often the experience is lost, or at least becomes very thin. And then again you have to dwell upon it, invite it, it returns, grows, and you confirm and fix. And by doing this repeatedly, you stabilize it to a degree in which it does not lose itself so easily. So that becomes substage. Secured against relapse. That's the substage. So first, in confirming, you have given to it its place, but still it tends to relapse, and you have to now to protect it against that. But there are two problems, rather four problems, but in two separate subgroups. Secured against relapse and the downward gravitation, and separately against failure and extinction. So 4 words grouped in twos. And each of these is important, and we look at what that is, what they are. Secured against relapse, we have seen you wake up after a night's sleep, experience is gone. But there's something else. Downward gravitation happens even when you have not gone to sleep. So I had this beautiful experience on my birthday when I went to Sri Aurobindo's room, or I had a special meditation. I felt the afflatus. And then as the day progresses, the system begins to be tired. I can't maintain this anymore. I need to now rest a little bit. The tiredness begins to pull you down. And that's this downward gravitation. You stay in that state of height, of a kind, of a certain intensity of focus or concentration of the experience, but other parts in you which do not share in the experience, which are quiescent, they are quiescent, so your experience continues, they begin to now agitate. And as they agitate, they begin to pull you down or pull the experience down. and there is the downward gravitation. And the downward gravitation, why is it downward? Why is it use the word gravitation? Because it is the nether region, the lower parts in us, which are the ones which get restless. They are darker, they don't share in that higher experience, they are unable to share in the higher experience, at least at first. And so always the shift is felt as if a down, because the lower parts in our body are mapped to the lower gradations of consciousness. Gravitation, because it literally a sense of a pull is felt. You will experience this when you're in this heightened state, and then it's as if something pulling you down. And if you allow it, you have the dulling experience. And you have the opposite experience of pulling yourself back. So, relapse is where you lose the whole thing completely. Downward gravitation is where you have this pull, and you know eventually it will lead to full relapse. So these two are grouped together. Second grouping is against failure and extinction. So the experience proceeds and then suddenly stops of its own. Why? I don't know. It was going on for so many days and then abruptly it stops. You could say that some other parts have become active, but you have no such direct experience. It just stops and it doesn't function anymore. And then extinction is where there's no sign. It's gone totally. You cannot even find a sign of it within you. And this also happens. But they are often the end result of relapse and downward gravitation. So you have had a few downward gravitations, you've struggled against it, and either suddenly everything is lost, or after a series of relapses, it fails completely and then it's gone. When it's totally gone with extinction, it feels as if you might never be able to recover it. And sometimes it may last weeks or months in which that experience is gone. Sri Aurobindo even speaks of his own earlier stages of journey, in which for up to a period of 6 months, nothing moved in his experience. All of this, of course, he is speaking of a completely different order of experience, but still, whatever level at which you are, you can have gaps like that. But still, if you are careful, and this is the nature of the spiritual journey, rather than looking at what you have lost, you can turn to something else which now is unfolding or preparing. And often something is allowed to be lost so that something else can fill and take its place. Our evolution is not a single line. It has multiple facets, as we saw some of these terms he has used: height, subtlety, riches, wideness, and maybe other facets. And sometimes our exclusive focus on a single experience prevents other facets from unfolding. And so it is as if the experience is removed and something else can now fill. You will remember Sri Aurobindo's recollection of the incident where he was at a block in his journey. Things weren't moving. Of course, we are speaking of a time when he was already in an intense yoga. Experiences of the overmental and the supramental were already on. And then there was this wandering monk who was considered a bit of a crazy fellow. He's walking on the road, opens the door and comes into Sri Aurobindo's building, goes up the stairs to where Sri Aurobindo is sitting with a cup of tea, walks up to him, takes the teacup, pours the tea out, places the cup back and walks out and goes on walking on his road. And Sri Aurobindo says it was the key that he needed for his problem. And he puts it this way: the cup has to be emptied before it can be refilled. So all the experiences which he had, which were so filling, had brought him to an impasse. And it was as if he had to let go all this for something still greater to fill. But all of this I point to in the context of our personal experience. If there was a movement of evolution in which the higher intuition develops and then suddenly everything is lost, it can be very disappointing. It can be very disheartening. So many years of steady progress and now it's all gone. What happened? I share another example of one of the sadhikas here who was given a particular role by the mother in the play that she was directing. All these plays had a very deep spiritual and occult symbolism and purpose. Mother would take some of Sri Aurobindo's plays. Many of them had Greek or Indian themes or something totally different. And it was as if some element of the past realizations were brought forward, and often the people assigned to play those roles actually represented those forces, and she was playing out that drama through human forms. This young girl in the ashram was given the role of sitting on a swing as a being of the angelic world and looking down at the human scene from a detached poise. And Mother taught her what she had to do, what the poise was that she had to hold. It was not a play acting. It's not look this way and give this appearance. It was what is the experience she has to have as she looks at the human world from the angelic domain. And so there is this subtle, detached, almost distant but large perspective. And the human beings are doing such silly things, and one looks at them almost with a humor or a surprise or interest of a kind, but in a detached poise. And so as the child is playing out during the practice sessions, Mother is infusing the experience in her. So after the play was formally done, she says, for 1 full year, she lived in that poise of consciousness. And then after 1 year, plop, abruptly it stopped. And so she went to the mother and said, Mother, this has gone away. And she was very unhappy because it was such a nice state. And you can see the logic of why it was removed. Had she continued in that poise, she would never fully engage in the human life and develop the other parts of her which needed developing. So it was allowed to stay long enough that it was fixed in her consciousness. But then Mother said to her, it's not gone, it has only receded into the background. Meaning it has been pulled behind the veil, but it's there. And you will have access to it at some point, obviously. She didn't explain all this, but that is the transmission of the knowledge. And of course, you can see an element of that poise even in her life today, after so many decades. But the other parts then were given a chance to develop. So in the larger scheme of evolution, this pull, relapse and failure and extinction always serves a purpose. In the Savitri, Sri Aurobindo explains how when there is that loss of the afflatus, the nature is actually doing secretly a very important work. That which came down is now made to percolate through the layers of your being all the way down, awakening in your lower parts something of that touch. Preparing now for a new awakening of the experience on a more stable foundation, because now it has seeped in. And the analogy is so obviously similar to our physical world. The rain falls, you enjoy the water, maybe there's a moment of flooding, and then the soil soaks it up. And you say it's gone, where's the water? Well, it's just gone below, and now it's nourishing the soil, filling the aquifers below. And at some point when it rains again, the soil will be much more full of the waters to be able to receive and hold, and so on. So, first stage you have to confirm the experience, first sub-stage you have to confirm the experience and then secure it against relapse, downward gravitation, failure and extinction. So these tendencies will be there. You have to secure it against that. What does that mean? And each of these 4 securities have to be worked upon. That you will never again lose it. Never again it will fail. So failure has of course this element where the intuition fails. You have an intuition but it was wrong because it got mixed. You prevent that failure. You prevent the downward pull of tendency in the intuition. And again, as an example, you will see how a first glimpse of a high experience, you try to re-enter it, you never reach the same height. You enter somewhere less. And the third time you attempt, it's somewhere less. And then it feels as if you have lost it. But this is the downward gravitation which prevents as if the full entry. But if you allow this process of settling, descending, making finer connections, you're again able to rise. All of this tendency has to be prevented. When Sri Aurobindo describes his early stages of experience of the supramental consciousness in his personal diary, in the record of yoga, there are these frequent relapses where movement that has begun now suddenly pauses, or momentarily it is lost and then again resumes. And this is completely normal until the integration is completed. And that's when we are able to secure it. So first confirming, then securing, and then, but not only you have to confirm and secure, but you have to open out into all the fields of its possibilities, its totality of entire self-achievement. So the third substage. Now you've got it reasonably secured, open it out into all the fields of its possibilities. Again, these are very essential words, and they apply in so many directions at the same time. The fields of its possibilities could be all internal. The intuitive consciousness now has to not only enter my intellect, not only enter my emotions, not only enter my physical hands and their activities. That if I reach out to do something, the intuition works through my hands and does it perfectly, precisely. So the fields could be your own internal domains, or they can be applications elsewhere. So for the moment, my intuition, because I'm a musician, works through the music, but it does not work if I have to paint, or if I have to speak, or if I have to write, or if I turn it to the domain of sciences, or whatever else. Initially, that which is created, even stably, has a line of activity in which it is stable. But now you have to open it out to all the fields of its possibilities. You see, he is using the most general words because it includes everything. Not only intuition, but every level that nature has had to pull out. Every level has to turn down and integrate with all its lower levels, and then turn to all the fields of life and organize in all of them. When the intuition, for example, because that's our immediate preoccupation in evolution, when the intuition comes up, for each one of us, depending on our temperament, it will first have a line of expression most natural to your peak, to your type. But eventually we have to widen it. It's totality of entire self-achievement. A lot of words, but you will go into depth, you will see what it captures. First, it has to self-achieve. It comes with a certain power. It has to achieve all of itself entirely. When the intuition comes, let's say, as a suggestion, let's say even as an insight, something came into me and I said, yes, this is it. And my mind jumped up and seized, and it caught only that piece. And Mother warns against this. She says you have to wait. When the intuition comes, you wait. Allow it to unfold itself, and it will reveal so much more. So you stay very quiet. You don't jump in excitement. Oh yes, I have got it. You often see this in television programs, in competitions where you have to push a buzzer. A question is asked and the first person to push the buzzer gets to answer it. So everybody is on the edge. The question is asked, I know it, and I push the buzzer, and then the fellow suddenly starts hesitating. What happened was the intuition started coming, or the knowledge started coming out. He pushed the buzzer, and the excitement of his emotions clouded the mind and blocked the emergence of knowledge. But if he's trained to remain quiet, you'll see his hand moves for the buzzer, the mind doesn't shake, and he has not lost the thread. So the poise of holding a still mind allows the full unfolding, but it will be the same for all the levels. I have shared this example before, and I will repeat again here. We had a demonstration here about 20 years ago of something called Ashtavadhanam, the eightfold mastery of a person. And it's a very difficult challenge, one of the most difficult to the human mind, where this individual is sitting with 8 challengers around him, each of whom puts a very different kind of challenge in parallel, simultaneously, and who has to respond to all 8 challenges simultaneously. Of course, in practice, he goes through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and keeps repeating. So let's say the first person challenges him to compose poetry 1 letter at a time, and each time he announces 1 letter, the person declares which letter he cannot use next. And now you have to put another letter, not including the letter he has blocked, and then again the fellow puts a third letter which he cannot use next. And at the end of the whole exercise, and then he moves to the second person, third person. Second may play a game of chess, third person may ask some odd question, fourth person will, and so on. And the seventh person is ringing a bell at random, and at the end of the exercise he has to say how many times the bell was rung. And the 8th person's job is to break your concentration. Every time you're concentrating, he will ask an odd question to break your concentration. So you are handling 8 completely different challenges, each of an extreme type. And at the end of that exercise of 1 hour or 1.5 hours, you have composed a poem in 4 lines, 1 letter at a time, which has to have rhyme, rhythm, and meaning, and some insight in the meaning. So in the example we saw, the person started with the letter A. Obviously, being in the ashram, he might have used the next letter as Aurobindo, because he's most obvious. So the challenger says you cannot use R, and so he puts another letter, and so on. It was an amazing demonstration, and he was particularly inspired here. He said it was one of his best so far. And so I am edging my way towards him, and I said, I have to find his secret. There must be some great training. So I go up to him during lunch break and I say, well, what do you do for the training? And he said, well, the only thing you do is remain completely equal, detached, still. He used the word, I think, equality, but that was the sense when he made the gesture. I said, okay, but in your training you must be doing something like amplifying your intelligence with pranayam and breathing exercises, something. I said, no, nothing, none of those things. Just the poise of equality. And much later I understood the value of that. And the value, of course, is this. And we saw him in that state. Every time there was a challenge, he remained unmoved internally, so that the poise in which the intuition was received was unbroken. Never a ripple of agitation. And that's the only way you can hold this multiplicity. The intuitive consciousness can hold it. The reasoning mind finds it too much. So this I'm giving as an example to point out that the thing which comes needs a vehicle in which, or a means through which it can fully actualize itself. The intuition coming in cannot be broken up and disturbed and bound into limitations of the receptive medium. So, opened out into all the fields of its possibilities, but its totality of entire self-achievement. The thing which comes is coming with a purpose, and you need the receptive state in which the entire self-achievement can be expressed. And then on top of that, he adds totality of entire self-achievement. What does that mean? So the entire self-achievement is from the side of the force, or the insight, or the power, or the faculty developing, let's say the intuitive consciousness now awakening, or the mind of light awakening, coming to entire self-achievement. But totality is when it applies itself in full diversity. Sri Aurobindo uses this distinction, and it has a deep Vedic root. He explains this distinction when he explains the difference between the number 100 and 1000 in the Vedic thought. 100, he explains, comes from 7 planes or 7 principles of consciousness in manifestation, without which you don't have cosmos. So any cosmos has to have these 7 principles, and which make for 7 planes. But within each plane, of course, all 7 principles are operative, which makes for effectively 49 subplanes. But 49 subplanes in the involution, and then 49 subplanes in the evolution. And then the origin of it all and the inconscience below, into which everything is lost. These make for 49 plus 1 and 1, which make for 100. So 100 in the Vedic to the Vedic mind represented the totality, the entirety of the cosmos. But then when this 100-fold expresses itself and expresses in all its possibilities, on each plane there is an opening to full possibility of 10. And by 10 he explains also, but the full possibility of 10 on each of these levels makes for the totality. So 1000 represents the totality, 100 represents completeness. 1000 takes it to totality. So here you have the sense of this when he says it's totality of entire self-achievement. So there's a self-achievement which is entire, but it must extend into its totality of forms of the play. And this he characterizes by its utmost height, utmost subtlety, utmost riches, utmost wideness. And then after a semicolon, there is a further 3 words. We have already touched these 4, so I don't dwell on them. But the further 3 words, it has to become dominant, all-embracing, comprehensive. So remember, every new power emergent, although it started as a deeper reality hidden behind appearances, coming through all this, at first it was always hampered by the medium and the resistances of various kinds of things and layers and domains through which it has to pass, on which it has to act. Everything is different from it. It's a new principle, a new power. Once it has come into its own and it has achieved its totality of entire self-achievement, then it has to become dominant. It has to rule everything else, and nothing else should be able to rule it. Until that is done, you have not completed the emergence of that power in evolution. Let's take the human being. We have had the power of our intellect which has emerged. To whatever degree? Has it become dominant? Well, with difficulty. Not really truly dominant, but mostly dominant in certain types of activity of human life. Otherwise, the life impulse still tends to cloud the mind, still tends to assert its desires, or the inertia of the physical still tends to dull the mind or pull it down, etc. But if the mind comes fully into its own, then it will be able to dictate life powers, it will be able to lead the body and make it do what it wants. Of course, in consultation and saying, okay, now you need to rest, I will give you the rest, but I choose. I will dominate and you will obey. The higher power which is originating life and matter should be the leader of life and matter, and not these inferior modes pulling it down. Now this, of course, can only go so far as things are, because the inconscience and inertia of inconscience is overwhelming. Until the supramental consciousness, which is the origin of it all, because it's the oneness from which the multiplicity emerges, until that settles in and takes charge, the inertia will always tend to overcome eventually. And that's why only a supramental transformation can finally liberate from all these. But except for that finality and perfection which the supramental brings, so much of the higher diviner possibilities can be had with these relative limitations, as we have with the intellect. We can say largely our mind is ruled by the intellect. In some people more, in some people less, but still. And so it will be with the intuition. The intuition can come into its own with a great power. It may be dominant, but not entirely complete in its dominance. And that's good enough until the supramental comes to complete and make perfect the rule of the divine down to the tiniest detail, including even transforming the possibilities which are lying in the subconscious and the inconscient. But the point is, it has to now have the greater power over everything else through which it has come out. So it has to become dominant, all-embracing. Every operation of everything else must be embraced by it and influenced by it. And comprehensive, taking into its consciousness everything else. Comprehend is to take into and absorb into your awareness. So it dominates by its power, it embraces everything, and it comprehends, includes everything into its scope, and nothing is left out. It is influencing everything, and everything is included in its action. You cannot say, my intuition is now very well developed, but it can only act in such and such space, in such and such time, or in certain types of activities, or in some parts of me, but not the rest of me. Then it's not yet complete. When you have come to this becoming dominant, all-embracing and comprehensive, then the new power is complete in its emergence, or at least as complete as at that point. It has to eventually go to utmost height, utmost subtlety, utmost riches and wideness. But if you have enough of these, you can say it's out. So our power of human intellect, for example, has become reasonably dominant, reasonably all-embracing. It even affects our influences our emotions and our body. We are able to even indirectly overcome the body's resistance through certain kinds of training, exercise, through certain machines and technologies, through medical interventions. What the body won't do by the direct will of the mind does by devices such as medicines. So all of that has made for a greater embracement, and the comprehensiveness, though, is not yet complete. The mind cannot feel everything that is within us, because the mind as we have is still very small, narrow, limited, dull. But if we can open out to the inner mind, that has a much greater power of comprehension, not only of our own individual being, but also of the universe. But we have a sense of what these terms mean and what they represent for the emergence of the spiritual being out of the mental being. Now, with this background, Sri Aurobindo is now going to turn to religion and occultism, the spiritual philosophy, and the turn of direct experience as the four lines through which nature is evolving the human being to become conscious of its spiritual possibilities. But this paragraph is not limited to those four. As we saw, it applies to everything. And so he concludes with this statement: this is everywhere the process of nature. And to ignore it is to miss the intention in her works and get lost in the maze of her procedure. We dwelt on the full sense of this last time, but just to summarize, when we don't recognize what nature is trying to do, we see the processes she is using, and we get lost in the process. So when you look back at human history, you're lost in processes. There was a war there, and as a result of the war, this changed. There was a cyclone, and the economy collapsed, and so such and such a thing developed. That's the process. And you see different processes used in different cultures. But what you don't recognize because you're so focused on the process is that in all the cultures, in all the civilizations, there was the similar awakening that took place. The awakening to individualism and reason. But the trigger points were different, the manner of awakening was different perhaps, and even the form of the individualism and reason was different. But that the common element was awakening of individualism and reason. And that is nature's intention. And it's easy to miss the intention because you're too focused on the procedure and you get lost in the maze. And as we saw last time, nature can use any procedure. She is not bound. She can push any way, in any direction, create a new procedure for a new awakening. And I want to dwell upon this a little bit. In physics, in chemistry, you see the procedures of nature. Sri Aurobindo gives this example. You take oxygen and hydrogen. They're both gases. They have no taste, no smell. You combine them with a flash of lightning, electricity, Agni, we will say, and there's water, H2O. First, why did they combine H2O? Why not H3O or HO or HO2? Two hydrogen atoms with one oxygen. Why that proportion? Of course, when you look at physics, they will describe saying, well, there is a certain balance of energies which then makes this to be equal and balanced. But why is the balance of energies like that? We don't know. That's how it is. Why did H2O form to become non-gas? You see, this is the example Sri Aurobindo gives. Water has nothing in it of the H or the O. It's neither like hydrogen nor like oxygen. It's a thing in itself, totally different. How does that happen? And science has no explanation, it has only description. If you map out, there's a very famous mapping of the chemical elements and the chemical compounds, which show a particular overall consistency in proportion of certain characteristics of melting temperature and density of the material. But when it comes to water, it's way out from that line. First, there's no clear straight line. If all was purely mechanical physics, there would be a straight line. No, there's an overall straight line around which there are dots. So it's a trend with variations, and we don't explain the variations, we just describe them. Water is way out of it. And it's one of probably the only thing, there may be a second one if I recall right, but I'm not sure. It's probably the only thing or one of two things which on freezing expands. Now all of the materials, when they freeze or when they become cool, they shrink. When they freeze, they are the maximally shrunk. They start unfreezing, they expand. Water shrinks until it is at about 4 degrees centigrade. And after 4 degrees, it starts expanding. When it freezes, it's slightly wider. Why? Well, that's how it is. That's how those molecules are. But if it was not like that, life on Earth would be impossible. Because every time that ice would freeze, it would sink to the bottom of the lake. And the lake would freeze from bottom upward. And no life could exist. But because it expands slightly at the moment of freezing, it floats up. And even if you freeze ice at the bottom of the lake, it will break away and float up and freeze the top surface. And interestingly, frozen water, that is ice, is an excellent insulator. While water in itself is absorbing heat or cold easily, the moment it becomes ice, it blocks the passage of heat or cold. Now the cold which is coming from above in the winter freezes the top of the water and prevents the cold from going down. The water inside the lake remains cold but not frozen, and the fish can continue to survive. Only water has this characteristic. Amazing. And it's as if nature said, okay, I'm going to have to make something like this. And then she makes it. Having made it through repetitive exercises of effort, doing it again and again, combining H2O, giving into it, infusing into it this quality, well, you have water now as a habit in nature. And so the suggestion Sri Aurobindo gives is all of these procedures of nature to combine things to make for other things and express totally new qualities which have nothing to do with the original elements involved, is a procedure by which nature expresses certain qualities of in substance, in matter. And science, chemistry only ends up describing patterns, procedures of nature, but explains nothing. The intention is lost. Intention in nature was to be able to form stable, expressive life and mind and supermind and manifest the divine in world, in form, in matter. And you lose the thread of that. Having lost the thread of that, modern evolutionary theory will say evolution is by chance. Or you find a procedure for it, which is survival of the fittest. Is a variety, and then there's the destruction of the weak, and the fit survive, which doesn't fit the data actually. It's more a fanciful hope that it would explain, but the data and the explanation don't match. So you end up with all these contradictions because you're busy with the procedure, forgetting the intention. But if you recognize the intention, you go to another planet. And without any other specific detail known, you can say, this is what is going to happen because nature wants to do this. And so you'll see in Sri Aurobindo's writings, when he describes the evolution of cultures, civilizations towards human unity, or the cycles of social development, he goes to these first principles. He describes not only the procedures, but behind them the intentions. And describing the intention of nature, the procedure becomes secondary. And you can see how if it had not happened through this way, it would have happened another way. If you look at humanity today, a general awakening in human beings to the sense of unity of all humanity as one family is an intention in nature. Sri Aurobindo explains how it has gone through many stages, from the individual, through the family, through the tribe, and then through smaller communities, eventually to nation identity, and then the universal or global identity. Having these intermediate steps, I think Sri Aurobindo says, nature has decided to discard those intermediate stages, keep only individual, family, and nation. Now, he could see this because he had a different insight, but he could say it from that insight well before you saw the signs of it externally. And what you see subsequently is this movement happening over the last nearly 100 years, where nature is breaking all these intermediate identities, but she's trying to protect family unit and the nation unit. But in the movement towards global unity, necessarily all the other units have to weaken slightly and struggle to hold their own against this new shift. So nation units are struggling, family units are struggling, but since nature has decided to keep them, they will survive because nature pushes in you. Now you saw a passage of nuclear families and then tendency of families to fragment. And at that point it seemed as if you project it 30 years down, families will be gone. There will be no such thing as family. But if you understand nature's intention, 20 years down there will be a reaction. And people will suddenly say, oh no, we can't do this. We can't allow our family to break. And people will feel family is sacrosanct, and they will begin to strengthen the family unit or strengthen the nation unit. Because nature in their mind, in their heart, pushes this urge. But if you looked at her intention from the beginning, you would know and you could anticipate that this is what would happen. And this is what you see in the unification of the world into this larger oneness. You will see constant oscillations and tensions between these units, but you know because it's nature's decision that this will be protected. Similarly, Mother speaks of this in the 60s. She says, nature has decided now to mix all the types, where earlier she created specializations of human types minds, cultures, etc., she has decided now to bring everything together and create a huge mixture. And she saw that because she was seeing nature's intention. But what you see is from the 60s onwards, you have people across cultures, across religions, across nationalities, and very different types suddenly mixing. Ethnic types mixing was unheard of before. And the few exceptions which you had always had to struggle, and they had social pressures which said, why did you do that? Why did you marry outside your culture, community, or ethnic identity, racial type? Now you see these mixtures, you say, oh, yeah, that's normal. So what? No big deal. But that transition took barely 40 years for it to become completely normal. And you couldn't have prevented it because nature decided it. So understanding nature's intention is extremely important. And fortunately, Sri Aurobindo goes straight to these things, fundamental principles and insights, and then describes the processes around them, but showing us the process without losing sight of the intention. Allows us to see clearly where everything goes. And that's why, although he wrote these things in nearly 100 years ago, he completed the Life Divine, the Synthesis of Yoga, Ideal of Humanity, Human Cycle, all by 1920, let's say, when the Arya ended. Already many of these books had finished. When he takes up the Ideal of Human Unity for revision after 1947, end of the Second World War, he doesn't have to change anything. He just adds a supplementary chapter which begins by saying, everything has moved pretty much the way I described it, and now I will give a few insights on where it's heading from here, with a few changed circumstances which are now clear. So in the earlier writing, he says, it could go this way or that way. If it goes this way, this will be the outcome. If it goes that way, that will be the outcome. And so in 47, when he reviews it, he says, okay, now that it's gone this way, and he describes further. That's about it. One additional chapter. Nothing needed to be changed. And that kind of foresight is only possible when you see the deeper intention of nature, and behind nature, the source of nature's intention is the divine will, the divine wisdom, of whom nature is an instrument, or the primary instrument. So with this we complete the paragraph. We have now the 3-step process, 3 stages in which anything emerging in evolution has to pass through. We have particularly dwelt on the emergence of the intuitive consciousness, but you will see it applied to the emergence of mind and of life before. But now he will turn to the 4 lines of development of religion, occultism, the spiritual philosophy, and direct experience. And each of these 4 goes through these 3 stages. And he'll give more detailed examples of these, which we will take up next Sunday. This paragraph necessarily took more time because it's something so essential, so compact, but also so rich in what it transmits. But I hope the further texts will move a little faster. We can, as a personal exercise, dwell on the emergence of our own higher possibilities and the stages at which they are, as a kind of an introspection, or as we work upon some of our inner possibilities, both spiritual and of the inner mind or the inner vital, and look at these in terms of the 3 stages and see what we need to do, how we need to intervene, and not get discouraged by what they mean, what the stage currently expresses. And so we can meditate on this for half a minute.